Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the new album from cousin Ayjay titled Sonic Dopamine. But first, let's talk about weed albums. Now, I was once told by a friend that if I inevitably started smoking pot, I would start listening probably to either trance or hip-hop at some point. And you know, the more I've delved into the latter, the more that statement seems to make a lot of sense to me. There's a lot of talk about marijuana and rap music, from casual mentions to glorification to even the occasional anti-drug screed. And rappers like Wiz Khalifa and Snoop Dogg have built in their entire personas off of association with pot. Now, I'm not puritanical when it comes to weed. I believe in legalization and taxation, just like cigarettes and alcohol. But I'm also aware of the fact that just like any other drug, abusing marijuana can have detrimental effects on your life. As for me, no, I'm not one to smoke pot. It's not my thing, and it always leads to an interesting question. Do I need pot to truly appreciate or understand albums like this that have so much of their style and influence focused around pot? Now, the obvious answer is no. If the artist is good enough, they can recreate the feel and emotions of getting high through their production and their delivery and their subject matter. Acts like Gorillaz and the supergroup 213, they were fantastic at this. But even then, there were some tracks which I just had to accept as a critic. They weren't going to make a lot of sense because of, well, they were written when they were under the influence. Like with the Beatles' famous I Am the Walrus or the Bare Naked Ladies' raps in 1 week, some songs are intentionally nonsensical and looking for deeper meaning just going to end you up in a world of hurt. The issue that I've run into, however, is, well, it's somewhat unique to weed albums, where I've called out elements for not making the slightest element of sense, and then I get criticized for not being on the same level, man, implying that these truths that these albums are trying to convey are only coherent or only relevant when you're under the influence. But you know what? Even with that possibility in mind, I was curious to check out the new album from cousin Ayjay, who, actually it's not that new because he approached me back in September to take a look at this. Now, that's okay, I said I was going to cover it, I'm covering it now. And while it's later than I would prefer, I was still curious to take a look at his new record/mixtape called Sonic Dopamine, which from the track titles and the few samples that I heard before going in, definitely had all the hallmarks of a classic weed album. So did it work for me? Well, you know what? Mostly it did. Let me make this clear. Sonic Dopamine by cousin Ayjay, it's good, but I don't quite think it's great, mostly suffering from a lot of little peripheral issues that just managed to build up and undermine this album just enough to kind of knock it out of my good graces. It definitely bears all the hallmarks of a weed album, though, in the listless pacing, hazy production, and seemingly random asides to oddball topics that tend to reveal a lot more than one might expect in the loose narrative that ties this record all together, but however, not enough to make this album something really special. So okay, let's start with cousin Ayjay himself. He reminds me a lot of Drake if that Canadian rapper was a massive stoner and did not give the slightest care about what other people thought of him. Unlike Wiz Khalifa, who hasn't quite mastered the ability to casually spit insightful verses or look like he's not trying, cousin Ayjay drops into the Snoop Dogg stoner rap template effortlessly, and it's a real pleasure to see. And its easygoing, multi-tempo flow has a lot of variety and a lot of texture. For his sung hooks, he pulls heavily from Kanye's 808s and Heartbreak template with a lot of the auto-tune, but where Kanye used it to greater emphasize his isolation from the world and his loneliness, cousin Ayjay used it to emphasize his spaced-out, laid-back escapism. He does mean that it can become a little difficult to pick up on any sort of emotional resonance to get from this guy, but you know what? That might be part of the point. The marijuana is a way outside of the tedium of his ordinary existence, and emotional detachment is a major theme of this album. And you know, if cousin Ayjay doesn't hammer home that point, his instrumentation and his production definitely will. Both show a surprising amount of texture and polish for an up-and-coming artist, something that I definitely appreciated, and do a phenomenal job marrying the grime of typical 90s era backpacker rap with the minimalist, slightly eerie and off-kilter synths of modern hip-hop production. Honestly, I'm gonna be honest, the production and instrumentation are the definite highlights of this album for me, because it so perfectly captured the escapist depression of just being alone and watching time slip away in a haze of pot smoke. The sound is dense, but it's never quite overwhelming. And you know what? The only criticism I will level at the production is that sometimes there's a few percussion elements that sound a bit too sharp in the mix, a little bit too jarring and loud. But you know what? That's minor, and it only comes up on a few tracks. Now, an issue that some people might find with this record, it doesn't really have a lot of strong hooks or forward momentum. But you know what? I'd argue that fits the tone. This album does feel long and listless and tired, but it's trying to evoke that hazy, drifting atmosphere, and you know what? It absolutely nails it. So, okay, what about the lyrics? Well, here's where we unfortunately run into a few slightly bigger issues, because while Cousin Ayjay has some interesting ideas and occasionally manages to paint some detailed and captivating pictures that really draw a lot of attention, he's not always the best at expressing them. As a technical rapper, he's uneven, with some occasionally strong bars and verses, but look, some of his rhymes are sloppy and he relies too heavily on repeating phrases to fill up space on his rapping. And that's a real pet peeve for me. I saw it on B.O.B's record as well. And look, while Cousin Ayjay is smart enough to try and build some empathy towards him early on in this album with tracks like Laid Off and Mood Swings, he tried to make us develop some empathy for this stoner. Most of that empathy burns away by the end of this album, and I wasn't entirely impressed with him. Look, see, Sonic Dopamine has something of a narrative, mostly delivered piecemeal through the verses and a robotic narrator. And like most weed albums with something of a narrative, or at least a pretensions towards it, it's loose, it's scattershot, and definitely incoherent, as Cousin Ayjay gets laid off from a shoe store, gets high, trips out, observes a police investigation next door, texts with a girl to come over, missed an interview because he got high, and finally smokes even more with this hookup so he can have sex and send her out in the rain when finished, which the girl next door, who he's been flirting with, kind of reacts badly to. Now, look, it's something of a tricky narrative to follow, and even I'm not sure I got it all right, but it's one that's not really helped by Cousin Ayjay's random digressions that don't, unfortunately, have a lot of focus. Sure, they fit the weed-saturated atmosphere, but they don't really contribute much to the narrative of the album as a whole, and thus they feel extraneous. And when an album is this long, those extraneous bits probably could have been chopped away. Some editing would have helped here. Where this album works best, though, is exploring the themes of emotional detachment. Cousin Ayjay never really bothers to explore his inner demons in detail, like what, say, Earl Sweatshirt did on Doris, but he prefers just to get high and ignore them. But the album does manage to score a major hit and a major plus for me with Heaven Boulevard Midnight Mail, a track where he dreams about flying to heaven and meeting his music idols, and yet when he tries to leave heaven, he can't. It's an extended metaphor about the downsides of emotionally isolating through weed or through other said methods, because sometimes when you get stuck in that frame of mind, when you get stuck in that isolationist mindscape, you can't get out of it. But the problem is the framing of this album is really quite murky, and I'm not quite sure that it provides the dramatic payoff that Cousin Ayjay was looking for. As much as he makes wry commentary while he's getting stoned, his real life is deteriorating around him in his actual raps, and Cousin Ayjay doesn't seem to care. It just seems to be something like he's accepted and he's just going with it. It's framed in a way that this sort of escape that he discusses is ideal. Forget the trivial nonsense of the world, just keep smoking weed and it'll all be okay. And if life gets even worse, keep smoking some more. This album really is a stoner fantasy, right down to managing to snag a girl through lazy text messages and just getting high. And you know what? I'm not quite sure it's self-aware enough to know ultimately how shallow that fantasy is. As much as this album might claim that it's only for people with triple-digit IQs, it feels remarkably short-sighted for me. I'm reminded somewhat of, well, that Ethan Hawke's character from Reality Bites. He never really does anything and just seems to emphasize just how smarter than the rest of the world he is, but when he's not creating anything, when he just stays around and provides wry commentary on a thing, he becomes one of the most needless, toxic parasites that you see in a mainstream movie. And you know what? I have to say this, like, even while I wouldn't say Cousin Ayjay's character is quite as abrasive, but even in the metaphor of Heaven Boulevard Midnight Mail leaves Cousin Ayjay trapped in heaven, not hell. It's an album that's ultimately glorifying and framing his behavior in a positive light. And you know what? I have to say that the gender politics on this album are decidedly iffy. Ultimately, the message put forward by Sonic Dopamine, at least the narrator, seems to boil down to bitches be crazy, and you should avoid women in that vein, however that be defined. When in reality, Cousin Ayjay's behavior seems just as self-destructive and potentially damaging of that the woman he describes, and yet there's barely any commentary on that at all. Look, I want to like this album a lot more than I do. Cousin Ayjay might not be the most technically skilled rapper, but he has a lot of good ideas, and his ability to create interesting and detailed text is really quite impressive, and there's definitely a lot of potential to show real insight on future albums. But as much as I like that, and as much as I like the instrumentation and the production, I can't help but feel this album could have worked a little bit better with a bit of a tighter focus and a little bit more tighter plotting. With the slow, meandering pace, Sonic Dopamine already feels long, but it feels twice its length because chunks of this album don't really pay off on any level, intellectually or especially emotionally. So with that in mind, I'm giving it a 7 out of 10 and a recommendation, especially if you like weed rap. For a starting record, I will say this: Cousin Ayjay shows a fair bit of promise, and I'd like to see the result when he finally comes back down from it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I've got one more album that I've decided that I'm going to be covering before putting out my 4 year-end list, so stay tuned for that. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums you'd like to mention that I might want to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to take a listen. Until then, see you next time.